although it kicks off the video.
All right, welcome everybody to another webinar with Honeycomb, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Kieran Sheedy. Kieran, do you want to say a few words and explain who you are and why you're here?
I certainly will. Well, the main reason why I'm here, I suppose, is because we're writing a book together on the subject of thinking patterns. Yeah. Just a little bit on my background. I am a long-term management consultant. I've worked for some of the big four, a few of the big tech companies. I've spent many decades doing this, mostly doing change management and specifically technically led change. And over that time, I discovered that there was an awful lot of behavioral psychology required to be effective in this place. I didn't even really know what it was called when I started. And the research into that has led me to this idea of thinking patterns. And we've come together to put this into a book where people can actually quickly and easily understand how thinking patterns affect performance positively and negatively. So that's me, and that's why I'm here.
Awesome. It's very good to have you here, and it's been a real pleasure talking about and putting together this book for a little while. So what we're going to do today is just introduce some of these thinking patterns, give you guys a little taster of the way that Kieran in particular has used these tools in his change management consultancy over the years, and how effective they can be to really take your problem solving in the client context and the human skills that sit around that to the next level. So this is not basic entry-level consulting skill stuff. This is advanced thinking. And we're going to dive into that. For those that don't know me, I'm Deri from Honeycomb. I'm the founder and managing director of Honeycomb Consulting Skills Training. I spend my time thinking about ways for consulting team leaders to develop exceptional teams, and I love doing these things. We're live now on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. Comments, if you can see the comment box, then please just let me know. Just drop a comment in, and we'll be having time for Q&A at the end of the session today. But before we dive into that and get into that, Kieran is going to talk us through 4 of the thinking patterns that we have. So yeah, do think of questions, drop them in the comments. We'll address them as we go, or we can save them at the end as well, whatever works for you guys. So I'm going to pull up the thinking fix. 4 flawed thinking patterns the smartest consultants fix.
Which is pretty hard to say, actually, isn't it?
Yeah. So Kieran, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through, like, what are these thinking patterns, and how should people think about them in terms of their consulting?
Okay, so let's move on to that first slide. What are they? So the context here is, and we've all had this experience, I think, you're running a project or you're involved in an assignment to a client, and at face value, everything should be going okay. You've got the right skills, you're using the right tools, the client seems to have a clear idea of what they want. All those things are right. And somehow it's just not going fast enough. You're not getting the results you'd hope, and particularly not as fast as you'd hope. What's often the problem is the thinking patterns are out of alignment. And when I say thinking patterns, so what do I actually mean by that? Well, thinking patterns are effectively intuitive behaviors that we have programmed into our brains by evolution. And because they have been around for a ridiculously long time, because they've evolved over millennia, and because they are actually a bit like breathing, they're kind of unconscious, intuitive things. We're not normally aware of them. And interesting thing about they're never not there. There are always thinking patterns being deployed at all times. Right now, all of us are ticking off and using these thinking patterns as we speak. You can't work without them. They're extremely useful because we wouldn't have them if they weren't useful. That's a really important point. A lot of the conversations about behavioral psychology and work focuses on fallacies, the problems with the way we think. And that's important. But every single one of these thinking patterns has an upside and a downside. And so they can occasionally be very dangerous, but they're also very useful. So when you say that thinking patterns aren't working in your project or your assignment or ambition, it could be that some of them just aren't being pushed hard enough and not being used strongly enough, rather than they are going wrong. Okay, so they're ubiquitous, they're unconscious, they're good and they're bad. So we can move on to
one of the ways that I think about this is that these patterns evolved as a necessary way of us simplifying the world around us so that we can actually make decisions and move forwards. And some of them manifest in personality, in the way that we show up, and some of them manifest in our thinking and our behaviors. And I guess to bring it to life for people, like, imagine that the situation where you're in a meeting, like, as a consultant, you've cracked the problem for your client, you've told the story, and as far as you're concerned, it's really obvious what is the best next step, and yet people are still blocking it. People are still not getting on board, and often there are thinking patterns that are getting in the way there. Or it may be that you've got blind spots and your own thinking patterns are not allowing you to see something that is important that the client is seeing. And very often we can, as consultants, I think we can get frustrated in those scenarios and not therefore progress and not therefore help our clients as much as we might do.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I think there's an important point there. Is, as consultants, we tend to think that we're going to be analyzing other people's thinking patterns. It is very important to look at ourselves and see which thinking patterns are affecting us and the way we're thinking. It's very much both sides of the table can be in the right or wrong place on thinking patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that, like, that building of that self-awareness over time is one of the foundational things that differentiates an inexperienced and less effective consultant from the really great ones out there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most important skills any consultant has is empathy. So just moving on with this story then. So this, I think, is a useful example to just pick out a couple of the patterns and how they might work. Most people on this call will probably be familiar with the Post Office Fujitsu Horizon scandal, where hundreds of post office managers were unfairly accused of fraud. Many of them ended up in jail. Some of them even ended up dead by suicide. It was a catastrophic mistake. And there was certainly a great deal of dishonesty in that whole situation. But I think most of us would accept that the vast majority of the people involved in the process were not actually being dishonest or malicious or deliberately doing wrong. So there must be other things that actually cause this thing to escalate and snowball to this extent. So I've picked out a couple of the thinking patterns that I think you can fairly easily see were involved. So let me run through them. Framing. In the Horizon scandal, the first evidence that there was a problem was that the end-of-day balances in individual post offices were just wrong. And the assumption was that this must be either fraud or human error. So the framing was, we have a problem here. It could be that these people are stupid, or it could be these people are thieves. That was the assumption at the start. That assumption, that framing, led to a whole series of decisions as the investigation carried on. So framing was an important problem at the start of this. And then you take the narrative.
That makes me think about the very common Pareto principle and the 80-20 rule that a lot of consultants use to simplify work down broadly. Like, you can get 80% of the value from 20% of the work that you might do, and often that can lead to us cutting down too narrowly. And in this case, they cut down the potential solution set too narrowly at the start and framed it, and therefore missed a big piece of the puzzle.
Exactly, and your point is well made. The framing is highly effective. It actually makes you much more efficient. It narrows down your scope. You can't start addressing every problem by looking 360 degrees up, down, every depth possible. It makes sense to use framing. It helps your brain to work. It recalls and makes available highly valuable stuff that you need to solve problems. So there's a good side to it, but here, as you say, the 80-20 rule was wrong. The problem was the unusual one. And then that carried on and developed into the narrative. So because the human error thing wasn't considered to be the issue, there's a narrative developed that the Horizon implementation had unearthed a massive fraud problem, which had been there all the time. That was the story. There had always been fraud. Now we know it's there. That was the narrative. And that narrative is very compelling. It's got bad guys. It's got a drama. It's got everything that makes a narrative entertaining and lock it in. And that narrative drowned out every other potential narrative because others were just less interesting, less sexy, and less loud. So moving on to the next pattern that was fairly obvious here, the confidence pattern. Now, the confidence pattern covers overconfidence and underconfidence, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But in this case, the IT experts and the tech people were very, very confident of themselves when they did their assessments of the system. They were very, very confident that IT governance was working, that IT software development was reliable, and that confidence was definitely misplaced. More obvious ones are confirmation bias. I mean, we all probably are familiar with confirmation bias, but the inspectors who were out there looking for evidence of fraud and theft were looking for evidence of fraud and theft, so they found it and missed all the other evidence, all the other pieces of the puzzle, which should have actually given them pause for thought. And then finally, a very important thinking pattern is social thinking. And some people talk about groupthink, but groupthink is only one of the social thinking, one of the dimensions of social thinking pattern. There is also the respect for authority, which is also part of social thinking. So in this situation, the Fujitsu Horizon scandal, if you were in Fujitsu and you started to suggest the problem might be somewhere else or the problem might be you would immediately become very unpopular. The same was true in the post office executive team. Any doubts you had, speaking them had a cost, a social cost, and that discourages people from doing it. So all of those, I think most people would say, yeah, they're fairly clear that they actually appear, or they're evidenced in the story of the Horizon scandal. The first three of them are part of the constructing patterns. The other two are from different sets of patterns. But if we move on to the next slide, Deri, if that's okay.
And just one final thought from me on this one. That social thinking piece that pattern is heavily reinforced if the framing and the narrative and the confidence patterns are all pointing in one direction. And I think of these patterns as kind of stacking on top of each other to create a real gravitational pull in one particular direction, and then it's extremely difficult to break against it and pull away from that the momentum and that is heading in that particular direction, and then the social thinking pattern becomes even harder to break. I see an awful lot in client situations where the prevailing stories and the framework with which they're seeing the world prevents people from looking at something in a different way.
I completely agree with you there, and it raises another point which I hadn't mentioned, is that the thinking patterns by definition interact with each other to reinforce whatever way they're going, if you like, whichever direction they're pushing you in. So if you're trying to solve a problem, if you start looking at it in general, it's quite difficult to work out what's going on. But if you pick out the individual patterns, if you find a flaw in one pattern or an aberration in one pattern, you can normally follow it through and connect it to other patterns. And particularly social thinking is the kind of foundational pattern that sits underneath everything else. We're social animals. We don't work alone. We generally tend to work together. 90% of problems are about solving problems as a team. So social thinking is a very, very important foundation to the rest. But it does have its own characteristics which are worth looking at independently as well. But that interaction between them is extremely important. So what we're going to talk about here today is just 4 of the patterns. And the patterns, the way we've organized the patterns is into, there's 17 patterns that we've identified. And by the way, I think that's a big advantage over the 110 thinking fallacies versions that you hear all the time, which is just this: everything's a new fallacy, everything's a new pattern. We've tried to cut this down to it's the essential ones that are the higher level and contain the others. And we've broken those again down into 4 different sets. Constructing patterns, where you're actually trying to build a solution and solve a problem. Analyzing patterns, where you're actually taking things apart and deconstructing things. Shortcut patterns, and which are kind of like patterns on steroids, because they really are unconscious thinking. They really do tend to be very subliminal in the way they work. And then experiencing patterns, of which the social pattern is one, where the way you emotionally react to things has a dramatic effect on the way you think. And it's stating the obvious, but it's quite useful to be able to unstitch those as well. But here we're going to focus on those first 4. And this is a diagnostic approach. So what we're saying is that if you have a problem, what you should be doing is looking at the situation and testing how each pattern is being manifested in the situation, and trying to determine whether it's doing good or it's doing bad. Because as I said at the start, all of them have pros and cons. So you need to be trying to find out which patterns are being useful and which patterns are being destructive. And so the 4 we're going to discuss are framing. We mentioned it already. How do we see this? How are we setting out to address this problem? What's our point of view on this whole thing? Intuition, which is an interesting one it tends to be a solo pattern rather than a team pattern. In fact, it is a solo pattern. But gut instincts are great when you can trust them when they're right. Confidence, we'll be looking at the difference between overconfidence and underconfidence, and also separating confidence from optimism and pessimism. People tend to think optimists are confident and pessimists are unconfident. Not true. There are a few things more dangerous than a confident pessimist. And then narrative. So how things get stitched together and how stories dominate people's thinking as they are addressing any problem. So
I think in each of those questions, for example, we have the word we. How do we see this? Can we trust our gut instinct? And one of the ways that I think about these patterns is both I and also the client and different individuals within the client, and then the we is the net outcome of all of that. And one of the ways that I invite people and encourage people to use these things is to not just think about like how is your thinking being impacted, but how are your clients thinking about the problem and what patterns are evident for them as well. Because there's lots of people that are bringing different patterns to bear on any given situation.
Yep, every single individual is running their own set of patterns. Plus, there is another thing about this as well, which refers to the I and the we. You can actually use this thinking pattern diagnostic entirely solo. You can sit down and actually say, right, what's going on here? And just think your way through and analyze your way through what's going on in a situation, whether it's a personal situation or work situation. You can do that. But it is actually really effective to do it in a group, to actually do it in a team who are actually together doing a diagnostic, performing a diagnostic. But to do that, you need a team who actually understands the basic concepts and the approach. But it is actually, like most things, working in a team is always a better thing. And if you can do a thinking patterns diagnostic from both sides, so you have all the stakeholders represented, the consultants, the client, and various parties who are being affected by the process, that will be 100 times more effective than a one-man band desktop study of thinking patterns diagnostic. But still, a one-man thinking pattern can actually give you the leads and the areas to focus on to go into that wider conversation.
Yeah, even just that, getting the group together and asking the questions of what patterns are present will bring a huge amount of awareness to some things that are often unconscious in those scenarios.
And there is a little kind of Trojan horse here as well, because everybody's fascinated by the way they think. We just are. It's human nature. And if you start talking to people about these patterns, you get the engagement about the actual pattern and the process, and then you're into talking about the problem without having to address it directly. It's a side route into some fairly nasty problems sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And allows people to drop into a bit of vulnerability and sharing that opens up a whole bunch of trust in that room as well, which can be really effective.
Exactly.
So we're going to go into each of these 4 patterns in a little bit more detail now. If people have questions, if there's anything in particular you want us to address on any of these, then please do chuck some comments in, ask the questions, and we'll make it come to life for you and as best we can.
Okay, so let's go. Let's start off with framing. All right, so framing, we've already mentioned a little bit, but just my favorite textbook example for this is the Mona Lisa. By the way, I was in Paris last weekend, and I just like to say for the record, I was not involved in the heist in the Louvre, despite this reference. Okay, just
an extraordinary story, that, wasn't it?
Yeah, amazing. But anyway, so if you imagine if you had the opportunity to go and visit the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, it is actually, the experience is actually very, very well managed. It is framed perfectly. Not only is the picture framed nicely, but that's just not the point. Your arrival in the room where the picture is actually managed very well. You can see the security around it. You can see the reverence with which this relatively tiny object is being treated. And there's a massive queue of people waiting to see it. So there's a whole lot of other people saying this is worth doing. So you're being framed by you're going to the Louvre Museum. You know this is an important object. It is the culmination of your journey through the museum. It is perfectly presented with lighting, etc. There are security guards and security evident, and there's lots of other people who agree with you that this is something worth seeing. That framing makes you go up to that picture and go, this is a great picture. Now I need to persuade myself as to why this is a great picture. It's a very, very strong frame. Now, if you were in a car boot sale and you saw a copy of the Mona Lisa in the boot of a car, you would be absolutely certain that this was a substandard, mediocre copy which had no value. It is entirely possible that somebody could take the Mona Lisa, stick it in a car boot sale, and not be able to sell it for more than a couple of £100 because of the context, because of the framing. So framing is really powerful. And what it does is, from sort of a mental point of view, is it brings up lots of associations and connections in your head, which short circuits the analysis your brain has to do. So it's like bringing stuff into short-term memory, lots of stuff into short-term memory. So that's why it's so useful, and that's why it's so powerful. And if you think about the Mona Lisa example, there's lots of different levels of framing there. I mean, you've already been told conceptually the Mona Lisa is an important piece of work. You know Leonardo da Vinci's name. He's a very important guy. That's a whole sort of conceptual framing. There is then the physical framing, the way it is actually presented. Even the hush in the room is actually also framing it. So there are dimensions to framing. You can frame something conceptually through words, pictures. You can physically frame something. If you're talking about something to somebody which you're treating as a casual conversation on the way to the coffee machine, they will assume it's not very important. If, on the other hand, you only raise it in a business meeting with everybody sitting on a board table, it's by definition a more important subject. That kind of physical framing is important. And your body language can actually change the frame on something as well. So framing is a multi-dimensional thing. So how are you going to find out whether the framing is right or wrong? A good idea is to check, is everybody's understanding similar? If people have different understandings of the context of the activity or the process or the issue that you're addressing, then the framing may be misaligned, and that's important. You know, little examples like if somebody's trying to make something happen in a work environment, is it being represented as a fantastic opportunity to make the business much better? Or is it been represented as a way of avoiding disaster? That changes the way you respond to something dramatically. I mean, it's sort of almost self-evidently. If, you know, the usual change hype has made something which is really a business as usual tweak, and it's been represented as this will change your world, that can also be very inappropriate and unhelpful framing. If it is a minor tweak, then it should be represented and framed as a minor tweak, so as not to get a massively negative reaction to it, which is totally unnecessary. And objectives need to be framed properly. Are they considered to be equally important by people? So that's how framing is important. If the most important thing about framing, if you have the opportunity, is to get there first, because frames once established are hard to shift. So if you have the opportunity, if you're going to introduce a subject or an issue, try to think through how you will frame it and make sure that all the aspects of the framing are aligned to where you want it to be. If you in a situation where the frame is wrong, you've had a look at it and you realize the framing is actually wrong. This has been represented as earth-shattering change when it's a trivial amendment. A good way to break the frame is actually to be a little bit ridiculous about it, to actually make jokes and just be silly about framing, and make sure the frame is actually seen as separate from the issue. That can actually help quite a lot. What else can I say about anchoring? Is a really good, sorry, Deri, go on.
I'm just gonna, just one of the things that I've found with framing over the years is, as a consultant, if you're trying to solve a problem for clients, and all the time consultants are pushed to come up with innovative and creative solutions, and clients don't want the off-the-box answer to something. They want something that's unique and proprietary to them, that's going to give them an edge on the competition. And very often I see those innovative solutions run into the existing frame that clients have of how they see their world and their business and the constraints that they operate within. And it's a bit it can be a bit confusing sometimes, because as a consultant you can come up with this could genuinely be a brilliant insight and a new way of thinking about the world, and the more brilliant and new it is, the more likely to be rejected it can be, because it does not fit. It's further away from the frame that the clients are operating within. So in order to get that idea to be accepted, you first got to expose and reposition the framing and the whole way that people see their business and the opportunities with it, to then allow the idea to be accepted. And that's one of the ways that I've seen these thinking patterns block genuine innovation in consulting settings.
Yeah, absolutely. And that particular situation that you've described will definitely have another frame acting in conjunction with it, which is the ownership frame.
Yes.
So people put value on things they own. This is in the analyzing set of thinking patterns. But people put value on their own stuff, whether it's their own idea, whether it's what they're used to, and that value is actually slightly artificial. And value on stuff you own is a very good thing, except when it isn't a good thing. So in exactly the same way as you talked earlier about the other frames, the framing pattern and the ownership pattern are actually quite strongly interactive with each other. And sometimes it's important to distinguish which is the problem. Is the problem that this person is totally bought into their own way of doing things, ownership, or is the problem that this has been framed as a hugely dramatic change which will change this business forever? And they're thinking, well, this business doesn't need to be changed forever. That's not that, we don't have that problem. So it could be the frame or it could be the ownership, and you need being able to distinguish between the two can be helpful.
And in the right order as well, because if it's ownership of the frame, then you've got to address the ownership and then address the frame. And
now we're getting levels on top of levels. Yes.
Should we move on?
Yeah, let's do that.
Talk about intuition.
Okay, intuition. Intuition is a relatively well-known pattern at the moment because of a book called Blink that was, I think Gladwell was the guy who wrote it. And a lot of people have taken away from that book, whether they've read it or not, the idea that one should simply trust your gut feeling. Gut feelings are great. Intuition is fantastic. You should always, give your intuition space. It's obviously not true. I mean, your intuition can be wrong. The question is, when is it wrong, and how do you find out when it's wrong? So, a good example of what intuition really is, rather because it can be, the word can be used a little bit too freely and frequently. The example I like is this example is indicated by the picture there. There was a famous story of a Chicago fire where there was a fire team putting out a fire in an apartment block, and it was going fine. They were working well. They seemed to get it under control, and the fire chief suddenly ordered everybody out of the building immediately. No debate, no discussion. Everybody get out of here now. They did, and when they did, the floor that they'd been working on collapsed. Literally, many of them would have probably been killed in the situation. And he saved their lives purely on gut instinct. And when I say on gut instinct, he said himself afterwards, I have no idea why I did that, right? What was happening was there was a fire underneath the original fire, a much bigger one, which hadn't been detected or reported. And that had dramatically undermined the building. Because of his experience in the fire, he knew there was something wrong, because the temperature spread in the building was wrong. The sounds were wrong. There was lots of it shouldn't be this hot if the fire is this small, that kind of stuff. But he didn't have to consciously articulate those things. He just realized he was wrong and trusted his instinct. The characteristics of that decision, there was a Daniel Kahneman, who most people are familiar with, and a guy called Klein, were both looking at this problem about instinct. Klein was looking at it from the point of view of how do you get instincts to work well, and Kahneman was looking at it from the point of view of why are instincts a failure. And they actually started to work together, put their two scientific approaches together, and they came up with this list of criteria where you can trust instinct. And the criteria are, first of all, the person who's having the instinctive idea had better have this based in expertise. Instinct by newbies is very rarely valuable. Very, very rarely valuable. There should also be a relatively narrow scope. Instincts about big, complicated things are unlikely to be reliable. And also, there should be a really quick feedback to find out whether your instinct is going to pay back or not. If those things are not in place, you should seriously mistrust instinctive remarks. The little picture of the plane there is another example of this. Swiss Air, many years ago, was very successful by comparison to other European airlines. It was playing a blinder. It was making profits. It was doing well. Everybody else was doing badly. The CEO decided that if he actually acquired all these troubled or developed partnerships with all these troubled airlines, he could make them all like Swiss Air and make everything better. And it was called the Hunter strategy. And he got the board to sign off on it, and away they went, and they started to buy in these things. Sometime later, Swiss Air filed for bankruptcy because his expertise was very good in operations of airlines. He had no expertise in mergers and acquisitions. And the problem was very complex, very broad scope, and it was a very long lead time to find out whether it was right or wrong. So none of the characteristics of trusting your intuition, and he had gone for this on an intuitive basis. So the other one thing I'd like to point out about intuition, that sometimes people start talking about, the team are intuitively here or there. Intuition is actually a one-man band. It's actually something that one person. It may be that a leader in the team or an influential person in the team has an intuitive answer, and everyone's pulled in behind it. But intuition is effectively a one-man thing. It's a single-person thing. So if you find, somebody what looks like a broad-based intuition, it isn't. Track down the owner of the intuition and then check whether they fit the criteria to be good enough to do that. The other thing to say about intuition is it's probably, most of the time, it's relevant in a situation of urgency. But there is actually a different kind of intuition, which Albert Einstein was a big fan of, which is when you've got all the information into your head and you're on holiday or you're out on your bike and all of a sudden the answer comes to you. That kind of intuition is also incredibly valuable. The same criteria are required actually for it to work. But that kind of intuition, because the intuition of urgency happens because it's urgent. That other kind of intuition happens because you give it space. So sometimes if you can't get an answer to a question, give the people who know what they're talking about a bit of space. Take the pressure off, take the time pressure off, and you will actually get further than you would otherwise.
Yeah, I've often said when we help consultants think about how they're going to help their clients make decisions, that the timing of when the decision has to be taken versus when the inputs are given is really important. And if you force someone to make a decision at the end of a 4-hour steerco meeting rather than giving them to the next day, it can make a dramatic difference. Yeah. The piece I really like on the intuition pattern is, I think it's good practice for consultants at the start of a project to be asking their clients, like, what's your gut instinct on what's needed here, and trying to uncover some of their intuition. But what the 3 criteria, expertise, narrow scope, near-term outcomes, give us is a framework for assessing how much weight we should put on that gut instinct, rather than just saying, well, the client have said this, so I'm just going to find a way to play that back to them or find a way to prove that analytically. We can start to understand how accurate that might be. But the intuition pattern can be very difficult, I think, to overcome. If you're an analytical consultant and you come from a view of, well, here's the data, here's the analysis I've done, here's all the research, therefore the answer is X, and it doesn't land with the client, it could be that you're going against their intuition, and that intuition might have some validity.
Yeah, they might be right. And also, intuition is, if you're in consultants are very often in a situation where they're a relatively relaxed pace, but sometimes stuff happens and you have to make very quick decisions. And in that situation, if you're in real trouble like that and you want to start taking advantage of the intuition pattern, because it's a very powerful pattern, the trick is give one person who has the most expertise the responsibility, ask them to come up with an answer, and then go with it without trying to disentangle it or understand where it came from. If it's a genuine crisis, because the evidence says if you ask someone who has a perfectly valid intuition, who is an expert, to explain their intuition, the quality of their answer starts to deteriorate quite quickly. So if there's a genuine crisis, tell one person that you trust to come up with their intuitive feel for what the reaction is. Go with it without analysis, but immediately track the impact to make sure you're not going down the wrong way. So, knowing and accepting that intuition has that power, but it's a one-man job. You can't have intuition en masse. You have to delegate to an expert and go with the expert's intuition rather than try and deconstruct it first.
Nice.
Which is nerve-wracking, but useful to know.
And that nerve-wracking side brings us on to confidence.
Very good link, accidentally. Most people will probably know the story about confidence and overconfidence, that 95% of drivers believe they are above average, which is an interesting mathematical quandary. And people are pretty, on average, people are self-confident and probably more confident than they really should be about pretty much everything they do in the world. And, some people would think, oh, isn't that a terrible thing? It's not a terrible thing. It's a fantastic thing, because if we weren't all a little bit overconfident, we'd never do anything. Speaking from personal experience, that's the reason why I've used the restaurant example here. The vast majority of restaurants actually fail, like 2 in 3 at least new restaurants fail. A lot of people think, oh, I'd love to run a restaurant. Wouldn't it be nice to run a restaurant? I love restaurants. Why wouldn't I love to run a restaurant? I've actually been through that experience. I decided with my wife many years ago that we would actually open some restaurants and try and actually establish a chain of restaurants. This was our brilliant ambition, which was terribly ambitious of us, considering neither of us had worked in restaurants before. I'd been a waiter in my past. That was it. So that very self-confident attitude brought us to establishing. We ended up in a situation where we actually had 5 restaurants, which I think was pretty impressive. But getting out of that, we didn't lose our shirts, but let's say we didn't make any money, that overconfidence led us down a track which was very interesting and highly educational and not very profitable. So overconfidence, and why is that a good thing? Because it creates value that other people get. For example, as part of our pivot in the restaurants, we turned some of them into ceramic cafes. One of those was actually, when we were exiting, we sold it to the manager in the cafe. And it lasted for years, and it became the base of his business. And he's been very successful as a result. So value does come out of this overconfidence, accidentally. The railways, all these people are overconfidently building railways that didn't make any sense. Lots of people lost their shirts. We got railways. Overconfidence is a good thing. And it is the normal thing. It is a natural thing. But obviously, it can also lead you astray. So it's important to be able to spot it and pick it out. Underconfidence is actually, people worry less about it, but it is actually equally problematic. Because if somebody is underconfident, they will actually underperform. They will not deliver what they could. People who are underconfident will not have the confidence to implement the ideas that they have. And underconfidence is, a real loss. It can be a real loss in lots of ways. And those overconfidence and underconfidence are both driven by the perception of difficulty and the perception of risk. So if you think something is extremely risky, you will naturally switch into a cautious, underconfident mode. Likewise, if you think something is unusually difficult, you will assume your confidence level is lower than it should be. So if you ask people to make assessments in an area where they believe they are not expert, they will frequently be underconfident. They may actually be more underconfident than they should be. They might have a perfectly good guess, but they'll naturally default to underconfidence. So how do you balance these things? The most important thing is to actually make sure that the understanding of difficulty and the understanding of risk is actually valid. So if something looks really, really complicated or risky or difficult because they've never done it before, the ideal thing to do is to actually learn more about it, to understand how difficult it is, to see other normal average people have succeeded in doing this. My favorite comment to someone who's learning to drive is, this is really hard, this is really difficult. Well, everybody does it. Everybody else learned how to do it. So it's not it looks difficult. You think it's difficult. You're wrong. It's not that hard. So a bit of confidence is a very good thing to have in that situation. And risk, I'm a big fan of proper risk management. Identifying what the risk is, how impactful it is, and how likely it is, and separating those two things, which many people do not do. And also dealing with coming up with mitigations for risks. And if you do that, you can actually take things being just terribly risky down to, I understand the level of risk here, which means people get back to a natural level of confidence.
Yeah, I was reviewing some research on confidence earlier this year, and one of the things that jumped out for me was that confidence is driven by how thoroughly the person making a decision has assessed the potential consequences and accepted those consequences. So it's not necessarily saying it's about understanding risk and accepting risk as much as it is about mitigating it. So you can be confident in your decision if you say, I understand this is the likely range of possible outcomes and I'm okay with that. And that then organizationally, that flows back to what is your culture around risk taking and failure? And are you willing to allow people to experiment, take risks, and try new things, even if it may not lead to a guaranteed outcome? And that impacts the consequence of the risks that we might take.
Yeah, and I think that plays into an interesting dimension of confidence and underconfidence, right? Which I mentioned earlier on, is that there is a confidence and overconfidence. People have a general tendency to be slightly overconfident. That's just nature, and that's very valuable. But another aspect of personality is optimism versus pessimism. And those things are a bit more of a personality trait. Over and underconfidence generally responds to the circumstances. You will be over or underconfident depending on what you're looking at. But pessimism and optimism are a bit more personally ingrained in people. Optimists tend to stay optimists, pessimists tend to stay pessimists, regardless of what happens. But we kind of naturally assume that optimists are overconfident, and that's not the case. You can be optimistic and very underconfident. So, for example, if someone is optimistic saying, this will all work out fine, I personally can't do anything to affect it. I can't make any difference here because I have no confidence in myself of being able to deal with it. But it'll work out fine in the end. That is a very common situation and quite a dangerous situation because you're assuming everything will be fine, but you're not prepared to do anything to get there. That's not a good thing. So your optimism is actually has little value if you're underconfident. And by the same token, very confident pessimists can be very, very obstructive to change in particular. And overconfident pessimists, who are absolutely certain things will go wrong, are very, very disadvantageous to have around. And that it's worth knowing you could change somebody's level of confidence or overconfidence. It's difficult to change their optimistic or pessimistic nature. If you have a pessimist in the wrong place, it might be better to remove them rather than assume they'll eventually change, whereas confidence and overconfidence can be adjusted.
Yeah, super interesting. So optimism versus pessimism is almost the direction that they're facing in terms of the decision they might take, and the level of confidence is how fast and how confidently they're going to move in that direction.
Yeah.
And whichever way you're facing, if you're underconfident, it can be quite paralyzing in terms of your ability to actually take action.
Yeah.
If you're also pointed in the wrong direction, whether wrong in that context is optimistic or pessimistic, and you're overconfident, that pattern can drive you in the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good thing about this. The difference between the direction you're pointed and your expectation of getting there is actually a good way to distinguish.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Shall we move on to the narrative pattern?
Yeah. And I know the narrative pattern are a favorite of yours and a favorite of mine, Deri. So it's just the way you put it in, so it'll stop us going on too much about it. But the fundamental thing is that human beings are the best storytellers on the planet. We are fantastic at telling stories. If you give any human being a collection of facts or a set of clues, they will immediately stitch them into a narrative. And There's, you know, lots of entertaining examples of that, where you just literally give people some random, you know, images or something and say, these things are connected. Can you tell me how? People will connect the most incredibly obscure things together and with great confidence. And once they have made the connections, once they have established a narrative, they get very fond of it and get very attached to it. So narrative is the best way to retain things and to understand. If you have a narrative around something, it will actually help you to understand it and to actually retain it and stick to it. So worth looking at a narrative from a timeline point of view, because there are backward-looking narratives which I can explain how we got to this situation. I will tell you all the things that have happened that got us here, which can be absolutely accurate and completely wrong. But if you have a wrong narrative for a historical narrative, you have misdiagnosed the situation you're in completely. Then you can have forward-looking narratives. I know what we need to get to, and I know the route. Here's how we're going to get there. Here are the steps. Here are the logical links between those pivot points as we get there. Very powerful way of explaining to someone a route, motivating people. But again, if it's wrong, it's very dangerous. And then there's time-independent narratives, which are where you actually are saying this and this mean that, therefore this. The logic of people of understanding and explaining a concept. They're also narratives, and they behave in exactly the same way. So if you want to deconstruct a narrative, the best thing to do is to try and find the pivotal points, the stepping stones in the narrative, and the links between the stepping stones. That's how you deconstruct a narrative. And then you actually say, well, is this stepping stone a guess, an assumption, a lie, a piece of misinformation, or what? So establish that the actual pivot points, the stepping stones are valid. And then look at the links between the stepping stones and see if we can actually connect these logically. So, you know, for example, if the reason why, you know, our sales are terrible, that's a pivot point. The competitors are spending a lot of money on online advertising. Well, therefore, that's the reason why we should be spending much more money on online advertising. It's a perfectly logical connection between two pivot points. It could be entirely wrong. It could be your product is rubbish, for example, or it's just not readily available. Your logistics don't work. So it's easy to find a link. It's important to test the link in your stories.
Yeah, that brings to mind a framework that I use a lot, which is making a clear distinction between what is data, what are judgments, and what are feelings in a narrative, in those stepping stones. And I think one of the first things, if you're trying to analyze the stories that are being told within your organization, or you're trying to put together a story, is to be really clear about, are we genuinely talking about data, or are people bringing in their own judgments and their own feelings? And if you can make a distinction between those different types of stepping stones and different elements of the story, then you can start to try and pin down like what is truth here as best we know, as opposed to other patterns that are at play influencing that narrative pattern.
Yeah, and that thing about other narratives and competing narratives. If you believe you have the right narrative and you want that narrative to be carried, there's a very basic trick about narratives, which I call it KISSS, which is you keep for the narrative that wins will be the short narrative, the simple narrative, so it's clear and logical, and the one that is actually soulful, the one that has actually got emotion in it. So if you want a narrative to actually connect with people, it needs heroes, bad guys, story arcs. That's how narratives connect. And even if the hero is the good news server and the bad guy is the old bad server, they don't have to be people, but they need characters in them in that way to actually connect a story together and get people emotionally engaged. So if you're wondering why your story isn't being adopted or isn't beating the other story that you think is absolutely wrong, test it and see if it can be shortened, because the shorter the better for understanding. So the connections should be simple and clear between the various components of the story, and there should be a bit of emotion in the story. It's important to get that in there as well.
I think it's also really important for people to understand how powerful these stories can be. I've seen a couple of examples recently where like genuine decisions were being made within consulting firms that we're working with based on stories and narratives that had been just embedded in the fabric of those teams for a decade or more, even in situations where the main characters in those stories had left the business many, many years earlier. But the way that those people ran their own personal businesses, the decisions that they took, were still influencing decisions today because their stories have been kept alive in that business. And so it could be that there's a story that we're not that type of firm, or that's not how we work, or we don't do those things. And because it becomes so ingrained in a team, because those stories are kept alive, then people believe that, and it's difficult to then break away and say, well, why don't we do those things? Like what was the data that was driving that decision back in the day? Or was it just somebody's feelings around it? They didn't like the idea of doing it. And if you realize that there's something that you're not doing that maybe others are, or that you should be doing, like, I'd really encourage, have a look at the stories that you're telling each other and see whether that is getting in your way of making the right decision for the context you're in right now. Because it could be that there's some legacy historical pattern there that is being reinforced because they're entertaining stories to tell. And they've been refined over the years into the entertaining stories to tell that everybody enjoys and it resonates with them. But actually, there could be a knock-on impact of those things.
And it could be that those stories were valid, right, and useful at that time. And they just simply aren't that way anymore. And this is another place of interaction. So those stories will be establishing frames, and they're also reinforcing ownership. So those other two patterns are being reinforced by the narrative pattern in that particular context.
Yeah, absolutely. Narratives are so foundational, I think, and particularly in the overarching world of constructing patterns, when you're trying to get something going, trying to build something new, trying to get a new piece off the ground. Like the right story to tell can make such a phenomenal difference in the direction that you head in, the pace that you head in that direction with, and how much you stay on track with it as well.
Yeah, and I just on that one, I think very often in those situations, we're naturally inclined to a forward-looking story, but it's worth putting a little bit of investment into the backstory and actually making sure the backstory is the right backstory and has the right messages and does establish the right frame. And if it's a powerful story, then its framing effect will be far more than if it's a weak story. And, the establishing histories can be very powerful in that way.
Yeah. So we go full loop. You've got to think about the frame, you've got to draw in the intuition, you've got to assess the confidence levels, and then put together the narrative that reinforces all of those pieces in the direction that you have identified as being the most valuable one for you or your clients. We're coming to the end of our time. I just wonder is there any, what's the kind of practical guidance here for someone who's sitting there thinking, my project is a bit stuck, I'd like to figure out which of these patterns might be playing a role in that. Like, how do I get started on thinking about bringing these different patterns to light, to shining a light on them, understanding them, and potentially shifting them? What's the kind of practical first few steps for someone to take?
Well, I would say as you say, the sequence here is a good way to actually start looking at it. The frame is a very good place to start. And if you want to actually establish what the frame is, a good way to do that is just to casually and, in a relaxed, confrontational way, just ask people to explain the context to you from their perspective. And try to get over the fact that do you look like an idiot because you're asking someone to explain the context because you're supposed to understand the context? Say, look, I think I understand the context from my point of view, but I want to hear your point of view. Just tell me where this is going, where does it come from? What's the big issue? What's the small issue here? Who's key? Who's not? Just ask some open questions, and then do the same thing with somebody who's got a different perspective. You need to deliberately scan all the stakeholders, however many there are, to try and understand if there's differences. But there could be people in the same stakeholder group who have very different frames, and there could be people from different stakeholder groups who have different frames. So the very first thing to do is to try and find the frame. And if you actually try and describe the frame, to just write it down, you will actually get a very good start. And I think that's an excellent place to start. Then stepping through these individual patterns, if people are interested, they can download these notes, which actually have a series of questions you might want to ask yourself, and a little bit of reminder of what the patterns are actually about, which could help. But it is worth mentioning as well that there are lots of other patterns in the background here. These are 4 of 17 patterns. So you have to wait until we get the book out, and then you'd be really good at it.
Yeah, that's the actual practical next step is wait until we've published the book, and then please do let us know if you want to know more about this stuff. Do download the slides that will give you a kind of starting point, and we are writing a book which will come out next year. If you're interested in that, then let us know, and we'll make sure you're notified when it comes out. We also have a whole bunch of stuff that if you're new to Honeycomb, we help people with. So we have over 5,000 consultants get some insight and input from us on a regular basis, whether that's our newsletters, webinars like this, all of the content that we share on LinkedIn. If you want to get a handle on any of that stuff, then scan the big QR code on the page there. I'll take you through to our website, and you can drop your email in and get onto our mailing lists. All of that, we're very passionate about the fact that this is all human generated, and it comes from myself, from my business partners, from our trainers, everybody who's working on the front line with consultants and consulting teams, sharing what we're learning and sharing what we know and what we've built over our decades of experience in this space. So loads of value there if you want to sign up for that. If you want to have a chat with me about any training or development requirements, then the Calendly link at the bottom with another QR code. Please feel free to book some time in my diary. I would love to chat. If you've got questions about the thinking fix or thinking patterns, then same. Please book some time in. I would love to chat more.
We should probably mention that if you're interested in the comprehensive picture of the thinking fix, though the book isn't written yet, the information is there. So if anybody wants to learn more about it or thinks that they could go into more depth, they could contact you directly on that. And also that we are planning in about a month or so to do the next collection of thinking patterns in this webinar format as well. Just worth mentioning.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So much more to come. We've covered 4 out of 17, and we would love you guys to put them into practice and let us know if it helps you break through a problem. Then I would love to know more about that. Awesome. Well, Kieran, thank you very, very much for joining me today, and thank you, Joe, behind the scenes, for running our live webinar, and thank you all for joining us, taking a bit of time out of your Thursday. I really appreciate it. We will be in touch soon.
Thanks, Deri. Thanks everybody for being here. And we get to give people back to